Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations.
U.S. President Donald Trump has taken the first major military action of his presidency by ordering an airstrike on Syria in response to the gas attack that claimed the lives of more than 70 people. The move raises questions about the American president's shifting foreign policy and, in particular, his country's relationship with Russia, which has been a supporter of the Syrian regime since the civil war broke out in 2011. With me to discuss the implications is the FT's East European editor, Neil Buckley. Neil, what has been the reactions of Moscow so far?
Well, the Russians have reacted very strongly and very angrily to the US airstrikes. They've said this was aggression against a sovereign state and a violation of international law. And they've said that it took place on a far-fetched pretext, quote. In other words, they simply don't agree with the US reasoning behind the attack. And in a direct retaliation, President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia will suspend cooperation on the so-called deconfliction line, which is the means of communication allowing US and Russian air forces to tell each other what they're going to do in Syria.
Of course, the Americans did inform the Russians, apparently 30 minutes before, so that they could get any people who were there out.
They did inform them, but using this very deconfliction line, which Mr. Putin this morning has said is now going to be suspended. So that does increase the possibility in the period of this suspension that there could be some kind of clash between US and, or coalition, US-led coalition and Russian air forces in the region. Although they tend to operate in different places, the skies are very crowded over Syria. So there is a considerably increased risk now. The
Russian position is, of course, quite hypocritical because the Russians have been bombing Syria and indeed engaging in the bombing of civilians.
Yep.
So to call this an aggression on the part of the US when they are both a party to this agreement on chemical weapons. Take us a little bit back to that time when that agreement was made.
Well, the Russians have always said that the difference between their presence in Syria and the US presence is that the Russians are there at the invitation of Bashar al-Assad. Therefore, their presence is completely legitimate under international law, and that the US presence is illegitimate because they weren't invited, but they've, if you like, tolerated the US presence there. I agree with you, it's a somewhat hypocritical line to take. But of course, this US action challenges the Russians in another way because Russia put pressure on Bashar al-Assad to hand over Syria's chemical weapons after the previous attacks in 2013. And it was something of a diplomatic coup for Putin to achieve that. The US backed off from airstrikes at that point. Russia said, we'll take care of the chemical weapons. And the Russians say, we have done that. We do not believe the Syrians have any left. And therefore, it wasn't the Syrians who carried out this attack.
What do you think will be the implications of this for US-Russia relations? Since the elections of Trump, Russia's been the most controversial issue in the US. At the same time, President Trump has never said a bad word about President Putin. So there was an expectation that there would be a reset of the relationship. Does this bring an end to all this speculation?
I think it makes it much less likely, or one might say even less likely, that there'll be some kind of rapprochement. We already saw that possibility recede with the publicity over Russian interference, alleged interference in the US election, and particularly the resignation of General Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor. But it may be, and you're a Middle East specialist, that within Syria itself, there may still be scope for some kind of deal between the US and
yes,
Russia.
I wonder now whether it's more likely that the US and the Russians can agree on a diplomatic solution, which is the only way out, and whereby eventually Assad is actually removed, because he has become a real liability for Putin as well, hasn't he?
He's become a liability, but Russia has always been very reluctant to countenance the removal of Bashar al-Assad because they see that as another in a long line of US-led regime changes and also as something that potentially will be very destabilising. They point to Libya, they point to Iraq and say, look what has happened in other countries. It always causes chaos. It will only cause chaos here. They're pretty entrenched in that position. But as I said earlier on, we're in a very risky and dangerous period now, and there's a possibility that that might produce cooperation.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.